The morning I signed the papers on the Muskoka property, I sat alone in the lawyer's office on Bay Street and cried. Not because I was sad, because for the first time in 11 years, I felt like I could breathe again. My name is Gordon Haley. I'm 63 years old, and I spent the better part of my adult life building a small maple syrup operation in Lanark County into something real, not flashy, not the kind of thing you'd see on Dragon's Den. Just a honest, stubborn little business that grew because I refused to let it die, even when my own family told me I was wasting my time. I want to tell you what happened last September, but to understand it, you have to know what came before. My son, I'll call him my son because that's what he is, even if he stopped acting like it, married a woman named Daphne about 12 years ago. I liked her at first. She was sharp, well-dressed, the kind of person who knew exactly what to say in any room. My late wife Elaine said she reminded her of a real estate agent who never stops working. Elaine had a way of seeing people clearly that I never quite managed. Elaine passed in the winter of 2011, pancreatic cancer, 12 weeks from diagnosis to the end. My son was good during that time, I'll give him that. He flew in from Calgary, he sat with her, he held her hand. Daphne stayed at the hotel. After the funeral, things changed gradually. The way ice melts, you don't notice until there's a puddle on the floor. First it was the holidays. They couldn't make it to Lanark for Christmas because Daphne's family was in Vancouver. Fair enough, 1 year. Then 2. Then it became the permanent arrangement without anyone saying so directly. My son called it splitting the holidays evenly, but even split always seemed to mean I got Easter, and they always found a reason to be somewhere else by Good Friday. Then came the comments about the farm. Daphne thought the operation was a hobby. She said it nicely at first. "How's your little project going, Gordon?" But the implication was clear. She was an accountant with a downtown Calgary firm by then, and she had that specific brand of confidence that comes from watching numbers and believing numbers are all that matter. My syrup operation had cleared about $340,000 that year. Not millions, not Bay Street money, but real money, honest money, the kind that doesn't vanish in a quarterly correction. My son started echoing her language. "Dad, have you thought about selling the land and retiring properly? The market in Lanark is decent right now." He said it like I was holding on to a rusted-out truck for sentimental reasons, like I hadn't spent 30 years learning every tree on that property. Then came the conversation that ended everything. It was Thanksgiving 2014. They'd actually come to visit, a small miracle, and we were sitting around the table I'd built myself from ash wood in 1987. My son announced that they were thinking about restructuring family finances and that it would be helpful if I considered signing a portion of the Lanark property over to him as an early inheritance, to help with a mortgage they were taking on in Calgary. I asked him to repeat himself. He repeated himself. Daphne added that it was just practical planning and that I should want to see my grandchildren, their daughter, my granddaughter Ivy, who was 7 at the time, benefit from the asset while it still had value. I told them I wasn't signing anything over to anyone, that the property was a work in business, and that if they needed help with a mortgage, they should talk to a bank like everyone else. Daphne put down her fork and said very quietly, "We thought you might say that." My son wouldn't look at me. They left the next morning. My son called 2 weeks later to tell me that they felt it was best to take some space. I said fine. I thought it would be a few months. It was 11 years. 11 years! Ivy grew up in that time. I got cards at Christmas, signed by my son, nothing from Daphne, sometimes a small photo of Ivy included. She had Elaine's eyes. That was the part that got me every time. I'd look at that little photo on my fridge and see my wife looking back at me. I tried calling on Ivy's birthdays. Sometimes my son answered and we'd have a brief, careful conversation, the kind you have with someone you used to know, Sometimes the call went straight to voicemail. I stopped leaving messages after a while because I couldn't figure out what to say that didn't sound like an accusation or a plea. Meanwhile, I worked. I'm not going to pretend I was noble about it. I was angry, and anger is useful fuel if you're careful. I expanded the operation, brought in a business partner named, well, I'll call him my partner, a man I'd known since we coached minor hockey together in the 90s, and we started producing small batch specialty grades that the Toronto restaurant market had started paying serious attention to. We got a listing in one of those upscale grocery chains. Then, too, we started doing private label contracts for a hotel group in Quebec City. By 2022, the business was valued at just over $4 million. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was hiding it, I just had no one to tell. In the spring of 2023, my partner wanted to retire. His knees were done, and his wife had family in Kelowna they wanted to be closer to. We talked about it over coffee in my kitchen for about 3 hours, and I agreed to buy him out. To do that, I sold the Lanark property, the land, the equipment, the brand, to a larger agri-food company out of Ottawa for $6.2 million. I retained a consulting contract and kept the house in town, but the farm itself was done. After the sale closed, I bought the Muskoka property, a 3-bedroom cottage on a private lake 2 hours north of Toronto. Proper dock, screened porch, a wood stove I fired up the first night even though it wasn't cold enough to need it. I sat on that porch with a glass of scotch and listened to the loons and thought, this is fine, this is enough. I was 62 years old and alone and genuinely, quietly content. That lasted about 4 months. My son called in August. I almost didn't answer. It was a Saturday evening and I was cleaning fish on the dock, and when I saw his name on the phone, I stood there for 3 full rings deciding. I answered because he was still my son. He said he'd heard about the sale. I didn't ask how news moves in communities even when you think you've been quiet about it. He said he was glad things had worked out. He said he and Daphne had been going through a difficult period. He said he thought maybe it was time to reconnect. I said I thought so too. I want to be clear about something. I knew on that dock, holding a Wally in one hand and my phone in the other, exactly what was coming. I am not a stupid man. I am not a stupid man. I knew why 11 years of silence had suddenly ended, but I also knew there was an 18-year-old girl somewhere in Calgary who had Elaine's eyes, and if there was any chance of knowing her, I was going to take it. What I didn't expect was the speed. They arrived 3 weeks later. Not just my son, Daphne and Ivy too, drove the Alberta plates all the way to Muskoka. Ivy was taller than I'd imagined from the Christmas photos. She had Elaine's posture too, that straight-back way of moving through a room. She shook my hand on the porch and said, "Hi, I'm Ivy," very formally, like she wasn't sure what the protocol was. And I said, "I know. I've been following you your whole life." And something in her face shifted a little, something that wasn't quite a smile, but was close. Daphne looked around the cottage like she was assessing square footage. My son hugged me. It was the hug of someone practicing a thing they used to know how to do naturally. We had dinner. I'd made a proper meal, baked lake trout, roasted vegetables, wild rice. Daphne said very little. My son talked about Calgary real estate, his job at an engineering firm, some renovation they were planning. Ivy ate steadily and watched everything with her grandmother's eyes. After dinner, my son helped me with the dishes. Daphne took Ivy for a walk down to the dock. And then, elbow deep in soapy water, my son said, "Dad, I want to apologize for how things went." I waited. He said he knew they'd hurt me. He said Daphne had strong opinions, and he'd followed her lead when he shouldn't have. He said he'd missed me. I said, "Is that all you wanted to say?" There was a pause. He said, We've been having some financial difficulty. The mortgage on the Calgary house is underwater, and Daphne's firm had some layoffs, and we've been talking about needing a fresh start. I kept washing the pot. He said, "We thought maybe with the Muskoka place being so large and you being here alone." I set the pot down. I turned and looked at my son. He was 51 years old. He looked tired. He looked like someone who'd been coached through this conversation. I said, "Where is this going?" He said, "We thought maybe we could stay for a while we figure things out." I said, "All three of you?" He said, "Yes." I said, "And Ivy, what about school?" He said Ivy had just graduated. She deferred her university acceptance. He said this carefully, like he wasn't sure how I'd receive it, to help with the transition period. I asked him what Ivy thought about all of this. He didn't answer right away, which was its own answer. I dried my hands. I said I needed to think. He looked relieved, which told me he'd expected more resistance. I went to bed that night and lay on my back staring at the ceiling, listening to the water, making decisions. The next morning, Daphne came to breakfast with a list. She had actually written a list on a notepad from the desk in the guest room. Modifications she thought the cottage could use: a generator upgrade, a second bathroom for privacy, a better internet connection for working remotely. She pushed the notepad across the table toward me with the particular gesture of someone who is certain their suggestions are reasonable. I picked it up, I read it, I put it down. I said, "Daphne, what do you think this visit is?" She said, "We're family, Gordon. We thought this was an opportunity to come together." I said, "You thought 11 years of silence entitled you to move in." She said, "That's not." I said, "I'm going to tell you exactly once what's available here. Ivy is welcome to stay as long as she wants. Her room is hers. I have money set aside for her education, and I intend to make that available to her regardless of what happens in this conversation. That's for her. It's not conditional on anything." Daphne's expression changed. I said, "You and my son are welcome to stay for the rest of this week. After that, I'll help him find a short-term rental in the area. I'll cover 2 months while he sorts out employment, and then he's on his own. You're not moving in." She said, "Gordon?" I said, "I'm not finished. You came here because you heard I'd sold the business for a number that impressed you. Not because you missed me. Not because you wanted Ivy to know her grandfather. You came because you'd calculated that I had something you could use. I understand that. I want you to understand that I've understood it since August." She stood up. "You have no idea how hard things have been for us." I said, "I do, actually. I spent 11 years learning what hard is. You were there for the beginning of that lesson. I didn't hear from you for the rest of it." My son came in from the porch. He must have been listening. He looked pale. I said, "I love you. You're my son, and I love you the way a father loves a son, without conditions, which is something I suspect you haven't given much thought to until recently. But love isn't the same as access. You don't get to disappear for 11 years and then let yourself back in because my circumstances changed." He sat down at the table. Daphne was still standing. Ivy had appeared in the hallway. I didn't know how long she'd been there. I looked at my granddaughter. "You don't have to be in the middle of this," I said. "Whatever's been said to you about why we weren't close, you can ask me directly any time, and I'll tell you the truth. You're old enough." She said very quietly, "I know why. Mom told me you didn't want contact." The room went completely still. My son put his face in his hands. I took a breath. I said, "That's not what happened, Ivy." I said it as steadily as I could. I walked to the desk in the living room and I pulled out a folder I'd assembled several months earlier. I won't pretend I hadn't anticipated some version of this moment. Inside were phone records, every call I'd placed, every unanswered message, birthday cards returned unopened, the letter from my lawyer notifying them of Elaine's memorial request that had never received a response. I put the folder on the table. Ivy looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at her mother. Daphne said, "That's not the whole picture." Ivy said, "Did you tell him not to call?" Daphne said, "It was more complicated than that." Ivy said, "Did you tell me he didn't want contact?" Silence. What happened next was not dramatic. There were no raised voices. My son sat at the table and stared at the folder. Ivy went to her room and closed the door. Daphne made a sound like she was going to say something else and then decided not to. I made coffee. I sat down. I waited. By noon, my son had asked Daphne to go for a walk so he could talk to me alone. They were gone for almost an hour. When they came back, Daphne went directly upstairs. My son sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd told me to sign over my land 9 years earlier, and looked like a different man than the one I'd been trying to reach for 11 years. He said, "I didn't know about all of it. I didn't know she told Ivy you didn't want contact." I said I believed him. I didn't say it was enough. He said, "What do you want from me?" I said, "Right now, nothing. Later, when you had time to think, I want you to be honest with Ivy. Whatever else happens between you and me, she deserves honesty." He nodded for a long time. Daphne and my son left 2 days later. They booked a motel in Bracebridge, and from what my son told me later, they drove back to Calgary the following week. Their marriage, I understand, is not in a good place. That's not my doing, though Daphne would probably disagree. Ivy stayed. She stayed for 3 weeks initially, and then she called her deferred university, Queen's, in Kingston, and asked about reinstating her acceptance. They accommodated her. She moved into residence in September. She calls me every Sunday in the early evening, and we talk for about 40 minutes. She's studying environmental science. She has a dry sense of humor I didn't expect, and she's already asked me about the maple operation in enough detail that I suspect she's been reading up on it. Last month, she drove to Muskoka for the long weekend, and we canoed out to the island in the middle of the lake and sat there eating sandwiches in the sun, and she said, "Grandpa, do you think you'll ever talk to my mom again?" I said, "I don't know. That depends on her." She said, "Do you want to?" I thought about that for a while. The lake was very flat and still. A pair of mergansers were making their unhurried way along the far shore. I said, "I want your father to be okay. I want you to have a complete picture of your family, the real one, not the version anyone handed you. Beyond that, I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left wanting things that are up to other people." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's actually pretty healthy, Grandpa." I laughed. First real laugh in a while. The Muskoka property is mine. The account I set aside for Ivy's education is hers, unconditionally, regardless of what her parents do or don't do. My son and I talk occasionally, brief calls, careful but present, which is more than we had. Whether that grows into something, I don't know. What I know is this. I spent 11 years being told without words that I wasn't worth the effort. And instead of collapsing, I built something. I built it alone, which was harder, but I built it clean. When they came back because of what I built. They didn't find a lonely old man who would be grateful for whatever table scraps of connection they were willing to offer. They found me. And I already knew exactly who I was. I think about that afternoon on the lake a lot. Ivy and I sitting on a flat rock on the island, sandwiches going warm in the sun, the water so still you could see straight to the bottom. She asked me if I wanted to talk to her mother again someday, and I told her the truth. I didn't know. What I did know was that I wasn't going to spend whatever years I had left organizing my life around someone else's choices. That's the thing nobody tells you about being wronged by people you love. The injury isn't just what they did, it's the years you can spend afterward waiting for them to acknowledge it, calculating whether an apology is coming, rehearsing what you'd say. I did some of that, more than I'd like to admit, but somewhere around year 8, I stopped, not because I'd forgiven everything and arrived at some peaceful place. I stopped because I realized I was handing them something they didn't deserve, my attention, my energy, the hours I had left to build something. So I built something. That decision, to turn away from the grievance and toward the work, wasn't noble. It was practical. Anger is fuel, and fuel runs out if you don't put it toward something. I put it toward the business, toward understanding what I was actually good at, toward the kind of slow, unglamorous effort that doesn't look like much from the outside until suddenly it does. When my son called in August after 11 years of silence, he called because a number had reached him. $6.2 million has a way of traveling. I understood that. And I also understood that the only reason that number existed was because I had refused to collapse when collapsing would have been so much easier. There's something I've come to believe about how life actually works, not in any religious sense, just in the plain, observable sense of cause and effect. The choices you make under pressure, the small ones, the ones nobody's watching, they accumulate, they compound. My daughter-in-law made a series of choices over 11 years, choices she probably rationalized each time as necessary or practical or protecting her family. And those choices built a particular kind of life, one where her daughter eventually sat across from a folder of phone records and understood exactly what had happened. You don't get to control the consequences of your actions. You only get to make them. What I wanted for Ivy, and what I think she's finding her way toward, is something harder to name than success. It's the combination of knowing right from wrong and actually acting on that knowledge, even when it costs you, of being smart enough to see situations clearly rather than just conveniently, and of having the stubbornness to keep going when the easier path is to stop. I had to learn all three of those things the hard way, mostly alone, mostly without anyone watching. I think Ivy is smarter than I was at her age. I think she'll learn faster. She calls every Sunday. We talk for about 40 minutes. Last week she told me about a wetland restoration project her class is studying near Kingston, and she asked if the maple operation had ever dealt with water table issues. I told her more than she probably wanted to know. She asked follow-up questions anyway. That's what 11 years of silence eventually gave me. Not the cottage, not the money, that Sunday phone call and the grandmother's eyes on the other end of it, actually seeing me. I think Elaine would have gotten a kick out of that.